Hello, my name is Alison, and I am a shellaholic. That's right, I'm here to confess that I covet these well-known beach souvenirs. Like any collector, I have my preferred tastes. Bivalves, like scallops and clams, can sometimes be interested, but I tend to gravitate more so towards the intricate whorls and interesting forms of gastropod shells, the very same shells that our hermit crabs favor as well. I humbly admit that I have created a small but rather lovely hobbyist shell collection, but where most of my shame lies is coming clean to the fact that some of these shells in this collection have been pocketed by my own hand from the sands of natural beaches in support of my habit. I'm guilty of beachcombing before I knew any better. My journey over the past few years through education and advocacy has forever altered my entire outlook on beachcombing. I used to think that picking up a bunch of shells up off the beach and bringing them back to my home brought me closer to nature. That said, as our population slowly awakens to the idea of the environmental impact for each of our own actions, I pretty quickly realized that my sticky fingers were contributing to a global problem: the destruction of natural shorelines and the ecosystems that these shorelines in turn support. A lot of this education of mine came from falling down a neurospicy metaphorical crab tunnel. It started off with a link on the Land Hermit Crab Owner Society website. This in turn directed me to a Crab Street Journal article, which resulted to the binging of all the videos in the CrabCon archives, a quick ADHD side quicks to view images on how huge coconut crabs are compared with garbage cans. That's the Burgess-Latro if you want to impress Dr. Christopher Tudge. Wait, who's Dr. Tudge? And what in the world is a crustacean plantation? Breathe. I guess what I'm trying to say is that hermit crab advocates and their allies are one of the biggest reasons why my mind and hands have both redirected where they pocket their shells from. And I can promise you this, it is no longer from beaches. Origin story time. 1970s. Lagos, Nigeria. During the week, a newly graduated photography student works to provide aerial survey photographs for the government. Weekends are often spent on a beach with his girlfriend to escape the heat and humidity of a pre-AC era. Over several years, a jar full of beachcomb treasures is collected. This jar eventually found a long-term home nestled among souvenirs of their time together in Nigeria, including their wedding photos, in a century-old farmhouse thousands of kilometers away from any form of saltwater. It was there when a decade or so later, an 8 or 9-year-old girl located this jar on an otherwise uneventful, likely snowy afternoon, and became immediately obsessed with the contents within. That girl, of course, was me. I was completely fascinated by all the different shapes and textures of each of the shells. It was like my own treasure trove that linked my little heart with an ocean I longed to see, a newly animated red-haired mermaid, and my dream of someday exploring Jacques Cousteau's underwater world. And just in case all the talk of snow and kilometers didn't already clue you in, I am sorry to say, I am, and nearly always have been, a landlocked Canuck, commonly referred to as an inland Canadian. It wasn't until I was nearing 30 years of age that I had my first actual beachcombing experience. A trip to Puerto Vallarta in 2011 with a boyfriend finally gifted me the chance to walk a beach every day and fill my very own shell jar with hand-picked treasures. Years passed, I said yes, and then I do, over the next several vacations we took together. Each one of those allowed for the exploration of a new beach and another souvenir shell jar for my collection. I was horridly hooked. So now that you've heard the backstory, we can actually get to the topic of my presentation, urban shelling. It's said that creativity is born out of necessity. When COVID abruptly disrupted everything, including leisure travel in 2020, for the better part of 2 years, the Canadian winter seemed to lengthen considerably. It was during that time that I found myself glumly partaking in some retail therapy at my local Value Village thrift store. Think the Canadian equivalent of a Goodwill or Savers. As I was perusing the shelf with no particular interest, my eyes gravitated towards a large glass jar full of pretty shells priced at just $2.99. Like a crab on popcorn, I pounced on those shiny offerings, and in that moment, I discovered that it didn't actually need a physical beach to find beach treasure. I could, at any time, just go urban shelling, and I went often. It wasn't until a few years later, in the summer of 2022, that urban shelling forever pivoted from being a rather selfish, single-motivated endeavor to one that spans multiple purposes. And that was all thanks to being introduced to these two guys, Marley and Manu, my very first hermit crabs. Like so many of you watching this presentation, the acquisition of a hermit crab completely changed my life. They also absolutely changed the agenda with regards to the purpose of why I continue to urban shell. My focus shifted so that urban shelling became a way to not only improve my own hermit crab husbandry, but to also support both their wild and captive bred friends and relatives. It's time now for me to reveal my top 3 reasons why I love urban shelling. 1. I'm frugal and thrifty with my spending. Disclaimer, this excludes CrabCon purchases. Hermit crab pants, especially those needed for our more chunky cast members, can be ridiculously expensive, as in more money than what I spend for a pair of my own pants, and then they need at least 3 per crab per size. Their cute little wardrobe is an expensive investment at the best of times. I'd also like to remind you that I, again, am located in Canada, so my cost to purchase also has an added exchange rate and cross-border shipping fee to further increase the cost for a shell. By urban shelling, I'm able to amass a pretty decent catalog of crabby homes for teeny small to large opening shells without having to leverage the cost of my own home. $4 for a jumbo turbo versus the 50 plus I'd need to spend to buy from a supplier is a huge cost savings for me. I've also been able to find some pretty interesting yet inexpensive crab-habitat decor this way. Coral, starfish, scallop dishes, even my favorite find to date, a clump of massive purple barnacles that literally cost me a whopping $4.99. And Mary, if you're listening, the captive bred babies absolutely love these for hide and seek. Reason number 2, urban shelling is a great way to obtain a varied source of calcium for my hermit crabs' exoskeletal mixes. Think about it. In the natural environment, these crabs are able to obtain calcium and other nutrients from an indescribable amount of natural sources, such as coral, shells, marine invertebrates, etc., all which can be collected via urban shelling. So I love that I now have the option to include these in with the other calcium sources at my disposal in my exo mix. And then there's the most important reason for me, number 3. Urban shelling is environmentally responsible. In the same way that hermit crabs are being taken from their natural habitat at an unsustainable rate, so are seashells and other commonly beachcombed items from theirs. In a recent article published on SmithsonianMag.org, researchers advised that they conducted multiple monthly surveys between the years of 1978 to 1981, and again from 2008 to 2011 on Yarga Beach, which is a small stretch of shoreline on the coast of Spain. Based on the area's hotel sales data, researchers estimate the number of tourists visiting that beach increased 3-fold over the last 3 decades. Over that same time period, the number of shells on the beach decreased by more than 60%. And that's just one small beach. But it also clearly illustrates that just one small shell pocketed by enough tourists has a massive and negative impact. Though seeming like a drop in the ocean, imagine if every global tourist picked up just one shell. The number soon adds up to billions of shells being taken from a natural shoreline ecosystem each and every year. The long-term cumulative impact is devastating for all marine habitats. That said, urban shelling has also provided me a way to give back to these marine habitats through conservation efforts, and even go so far as to support those aspiring to be captive bred breeders, so that we can hope for a future in which a hermit crab is never again stolen from their native shoreline for our enjoyment. I promise I'll expand on these near and dear concepts shortly, but first, let's answer the question I hope you're all wanting answered by now. How do I go urban shelling? Well, it's as easy as finding an urban beach to explore. As aforementioned, thrift stores are a great place to start when urban shelling. These are hands down where I find most of my shells at the most reasonable prices. Generally, you're most likely to find shells in and around the household knickknack section. That said, if you've got time to waste, you can always peruse the art, jewelry, and bathroom decor sections for the odd great find. For whatever reason, beachy bathrooms never seem to go out of style, it seems. Another great source for in-person acquisitions is yard sales, community sales, and swap meets. These definitely require a bit more time and patience, but if you're out and about anyway, keep an eye open for shells up for grab. Often, prices are negotiable and people are more willing to haggle. More recently, however, I've been having a lot of success with virtual yard sale sites such as Kijiji and Facebook Marketplace. The great thing about these is you can both urban shell and couch surf simultaneously. Prices are often negotiable and selection is generally a bit more diverse than what I tend to find in the stores. That said, I do find that virtual yard sale sites do tend to attract people sometimes being overzealous with their pricing. If you're still interested in a particular buy but the price is too steep, most sites will let you favor and save an item that you're interested in, and then you can revisit in a couple weeks if it doesn't sell and make a lowball offer. Just please always ensure that when you're picking up an acquisition, meet in a neutral public location, take someone with you, or arrange a contactless transfer. Be safe above all else. All right, so you've acquired a jar or two of shells plucked from your urban beach. Now what? Well, sorting shells is actually my favorite part of the entire process, as it parallels the treasure hunt aspect of beachcombing the closest. You never know what you might find buried among a pile of shells. Now, how you sort your shells is completely personal. I'm going to walk you through my process, which usually results in 8 to 9 different piles. But before I launch into the purpose for each of those, if your shells have come in a nice container that you don't intend to keep, set that aside, and I'll explain later. So pile 1. These are the keepers for my shell collection. Those shells that are just too pretty to pass up. Much like our crab friends, I inspect each one closely and only keep the one if it's a perfect fit for my display. Pile 2. Well, crabby see, crabby do. After watching the pleasure Mom has with her shells, both my 8 and 4-year-old have decided they want their own shell collection. So usually now a few shells will inevitably end up being put aside for those as well. Pile 3. Crab pants. This is my pile of suitable shells that my crabs can either currently use or that they will eventually be able to use. I even keep a small amount of micro shells just in the case that I ever find myself in a situation that I have a successful spawn followed by the absolute miracle of a successful landing. There's no right answer when asked what kind of shells might end up in this pile. Each crab's preference is personal and each urban beach has a different shell to choose from. Being in North America, most of what I find tends to originate from Florida or Caribbean shorelines. If you're on the other side of the world, in Australia, for example, your shell jars may differ greatly. Here's a Coles Note version of the shells I keep an eye peeled for. So, turbos, also known as turbans. These shells tend to be a favorite of my hermits overall. Turbos have a round opening and are pretty solid shell, meaning they're harder to break and can be found in their natural state, highly polished, with their pearly nacre layer exposed, or even sometimes with images and designs intricately carved into them. The West India top shell, or magpie shell, are another round aperture favorite. Also indicated by at least the magpie name, this shell's color is generally limited to black and white patterning. If you thought a turbo was solid, these seem bulletproof, both because of the shell's thickness and how weighty they are. Moon snails are medium to large sized predatory sea snails with an estimated 265 species worldwide. Despite the actual shell being overly spherical, their openings tend to lean more towards a D shape. Some species of moon snail can get as large as and bigger than a softball, making them a good score if you have jumbo-sized crab or two in your tank. Murex are also medium to large-sized predatory sea snails. Their shells tend to be more elongated and some have highly sculptured spines and fronds. Murex shells are modeled occasionally by my purple pinchers, but don't tend to be a staple wardrobe item. I've heard they tend to be a bit more popular with the other land hermit crab species, and because they are some of the prettier shells, they also tend to be quite common find in shell jars. Conchs are shells, but not all conchs are conchs. Let me explain. Conchs is an umbrella name that covers multiple species of different sea snail. True conchs often have very narrow apertures that most land hermit crabs prefer not to squeeze into. That said, many other non-related species labeled by name as conch are shells that often are chosen. These include crown conchs and horse conchs. Horse conchs are actually a member of the tulip snail family. Finally, to confuse you even further, we have whelks, which are often called conchs, but again, they're actually not. I think I may have figured out my proposed CrabCon talk for 2025. Anyhow, as if that wasn't confusing enough, we also have a whole hockey sock of gastropod shells that don't really fit into any of the above categories, but may still very well become your hermit's next favorite pair of pants. These can include, but are not limited to, Babylonia, nutmegs, crowned prickly periwinkles, ton shell, common frog shells, NASA, etc., etc., etc. Basically, any shell that has an opening you think your crab is going to want to potentially explore and may happily fit into is worth offering up to them. My only hard rule is that any shell that ends up in my shell shops need to be in natural state. To clarify, carved or naturally polished is fine, but if any coating is suspected, like a shellac-type substance to make a shell shiny, it gets rejected. Finally, just please ensure you properly clean all shells before sorting them and placing them in your crabitat. That means emptying them of any debris, boiling them in prime treated water, and then allowing them to cool properly. Back to pile. Pile 4 is for crabitat decor and full-size nutritional items. So this pile usually includes whole natural beach souvenirs like barnacle casings, coral pieces, sea urchins, starfish, or sand dollars. Those last 3 are echidnoids for you scientific folks. As with shells, please always ensure these are in natural state. If a sand dollar looks glaringly white, it's likely been treated with bleach. As with what we've been taught with food offerings, when in doubt, leave it out. Hermit crabs will slowly nibble away at these items, so again, we want to ensure that they are safe to eat and that they are always properly cleaned and treated prior to crabitat introduction. Pile 5. This is where I set aside exomix ingredients. So basically a jumble of broken shells, thin bivalve species, and busted up non-treated echidnoids. Once I have enough to process, I'll soak the whole lot in prime treated water prior to baking them for about an hour at 200 degrees Fahrenheit. With layered shells like oysters and jingles, this heating separates the sediment layer, making them more fragile and thus easier to crush up. Once cooled, I pour them into an old or thrifted pillowcase, tie off the end, and use a mallet hammer to reenact the printer scene from Office Space. A sturdy rolling pin can then be used to roll them flat afterwards. This additional step really just tends to unify the size of the shell flakes. The resulting mix is then ready to be sprinkled over food or stirred into your existing calcium mix to provide additional sources of nutrients. Pile number 6 is for any suitable 1/8 inch or larger opening shell that go above and beyond what I need for my shell catalog needs. I started to keep these aside and was able to donate my first box to Angela at Crustacean Plantation at last year's CrabCon. I currently have a tote that I'm filling to give to her at next year's in-person CrabCon, which coincidentally costs me about the same as cross-border shipping to attend. Angela's basically set up the Shell Shop of America in the form of transfer stations in her Florida Key backyard, allowing wild hermit crabs to trade up on their damaged, poorly fitting, and sometimes even non-shell options for a good, solid, new-to-them natural shell. Sean Miller runs a similar program through Make the Switch for Nature out of his home base in Okinawa, Japan, and is also happy to accept shell donations as well. The 7th pile is also a donation pile, but this is for the micro and mini shells, so the openings that are under 1/8 of an inch that may be of use to Hermit House's aspiring breeder program. At last year's CrabCon event, I learned that Mary was hoping to eventually build a library of these micro shells that become the first or second pair of hermit crab pants and that are essential to have once a captive-bred baby comes to land. I don't find these very often, and when I do, they're usually in the tailings or leftover sand found at the bottom of the sand jars. That said, I also save mini shells, those with openings under 1/4 inch, which can also be donated to breeders for a potential 3rd or 4th pair of pants. Finally, pile 8. Remember that nice jar from before that you didn't want to throw out but also didn't want cluttering up your home? Well, any shells that don't find their way into any of the previous 7 piles end up back in that jar. And when it becomes full, which sometimes takes the combination of several combed through shell jars, then it gets redonated back to your local thrift store. And here's the beauty in that. Maybe I can't use those shells for my purposes, but if someone else can, and it keeps them from taking them off a beach somewhere because they found them perhaps unknowingly urban shelling, well, that's a win-win for everyone. So, that's a brief description and explanation of urban shelling and what it means to me. Perhaps I've inspired you to more closely inspect the knick-knack aisles shelves the next time you're in a Goodwill for your own jar to comb through. And if nothing else, I'm just happy to have been able to share and celebrate the discovery of this fun pastime with you. Thank you for listening to my presentation.